My name is David Ferguson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Irish Comic News. So I'm going to get the others to introduce themselves. Quinn.
Hello, my name is Quinn Clancy. I am a very, very beginner author. As you can see behind me, I'm part of Cup on Fae, and we have recently published our 2 short story anthologies, one of which, Fierce and Proud, is entirely in celebration of Pride Month.
Helen.
Hi, I'm Helen Corcoran. I write YA and adult fantasy, and I'm a former bookseller. My debut YA novel came out in June this year. It's called Queen of Coin and Whispers and is published by the O'Brien Press. And it is a queer fantasy of manners with political intrigue.
Philippa.
Thank you, David. Hi, everybody. My name is Philippa Ryder. I'm a trans woman. I've been involved in science fiction for since the mid 70s, and I've written a lot. Not so much in the SF field. I've done fanzines and so on, but I do have a memoir coming out from Mercier Press next year. So looking forward to discussing this deep subject, interesting subject. Yeah.
Robert.
Hi, I'm Robert J. Simpson. I'm a critic, film historian, and occasional broadcaster. And my interest, I suppose, lies not so much as a creator of these things, but as someone who occasionally gets to edit and read and sort of just study them from afar. So I'm kind of looking forward to learning as well from my colleagues today on the panel. I'm hoping to kind of learn new things.
Okay, so start off with a basic one. In what the panel's opinion, what does identify as fictional world as queer? Quinn?
So, an ordinary world. I mean, the world itself is diverse, and any world, whether it's fantasy, sci-fi, or anything, can be queer, in my opinion. It's a matter of the author and the readers putting the intent behind it.
Philippa?
I totally agree with that, Quinn. I don't think we need to say anything else on the panel. Perfect. No, it should be normalized. Queer culture, both gender identity and sexual orientation, should be normalized. The important thing in any story is the character development, is the story development, and you bring in characters as and when they are necessary. And if you need to introduce a queer character, then do, but don't do it just for tokenism. Would be my feeling. Yeah, that'd be my basic premise anyway.
Hey, Robert.
I suppose the general impression from the public is that a queer story is one that has some sort of obvious element of LGBT plus. That's what makes it a queer narrative. But Quinn is completely right. I mean, any story is a queer story. The world itself is a queer world. It is just the world that we live in. It's just about, I suppose, where you put your emphasis in your characters and your narratives. That's what brings it to the fore. What separates it from something else. Just that element of concentrating on those issues and those characters and their lives. But I mean, for the casual reader, in terms of sort of making this accessible to people who maybe are outside the community, who maybe don't understand, which I think is one of the premises that we're trying to get to today. It's just about presenting it the same you present anything else. I mean, it should almost be. I always kind of feel it should almost just be there. You don't even realize that it's there. It's just there. It's just a thing. It's just a story. Yeah.
Helen?
I would say it's very much an intentional choice of a creator, because the world that we're in, not everything in a fictional world needs to actually come like over your. I'm just going to use novel for this sake. Your novel doesn't need to have the patriarchy, doesn't need to have a completely straight cast, and it's kind of what you say in that world, but also what you don't say, and how readers put their own assumptions into what you don't say or specify as well.
So if the world is like where queerness is normalized, does that kind of lose something when maybe if you're trying to show the struggle of queer people in the real world, Quinn?
I think it isn't. It's the goal we want in our own world, and by trying to normalize queerness within it and normalize how it behaves, we're allowing people to see the hope that one day the world can be where it wants, where we all want to be, and we're all inclusive. But there can also be that element of ignoring the struggle that we currently have. I mean, there needs to be a balance as well until it is normalized everywhere.
Philippa?
Yeah, I agree, Quinn. I think if you normalize it too much, almost, we do lose. In some ways, we lose a sense of our identity. Perhaps it's a bit like how maybe 10 years ago there were a lot.
So I'll just ask that question again. What sort of issues arise in a world where where people are able to choose their own gender? Quinn, do you want to go to that again?
Yeah, no problem. I might even be more articulate this time instead of phrasing it poorly. I read a great book 10 years ago now where certain people were born with that ability, and much like today, there was an element of conversion therapy, and somebody had started developing technology that would force them into a set gender rather than allowing them to change as they required. And I thought that was a very difficult premise and reflected on the world and where we are heading to and what we want to try and avoid. It's something that we need to try and move away from and just allow people to show who they are as people.
Philippa?
Yeah, thanks, Quinn, for that. I was referring back to Dan Simmons' Hyperion, and I read that about 20 years ago when I was beginning to come to terms with my own gender identity and realizing that I basically had to transition for my own mental well-being. And the passage in it was just a single passage with a character who one of the other characters said, "Oh, you were female yesterday, you're male today." And to me, that I just went, wow, how I would love a world like that where people could be who they wanted to be and it wasn't a big issue. So my only experience of world building, though, is I was a dungeon master for quite some time in D&D, and this was during my own transition, and I would give hints because I wasn't out to anybody except Helen, my wife, and I would give hints during the games by introducing sex change potions every single week and hoping that somebody in the game would go, why is the DM introducing sex change potions every single week? I can understand it once every now and then, but no, every week. And it was just my way of kind of wanting to normalize it, wanting people to know. So I think it's a difficult one because we do want to normalize gender identity and people embracing who they are. So it's a challenge, and we certainly don't want to go to conversion therapy, as you referred to there, Quinn.
Robert?
So the original question, can you just remind me of the original wording of that question, because I don't want to get it.
What about a world where people are able to choose their gender?
Why have it, or what's the issue? I mean, the idea of transmogrification in some way, shape, or form has existed from time immemorial. I mean, you see it back when you look at the ancient myths. So the idea that our bodies can transform from one form into another, and that whether that be from human to animal to spirit or gender, I mean, that all is something that it's built within us. We're all fascinated, I think, as a culture, as a society, by this idea of change and about being something different I mean, not saying being something that's not what you are, but being something different. And I think maybe somewhere along the way we've used those other forms of transitioning, possibly as a sort of representation for those issues that are now, thanks to the development of science and everything else, are becoming much more, no more science fiction, they're more like science reality. This is the way that people are living their lives. This is the way that people are changing. And I think somewhere along the way we're kind of predisposed to sort of being okay with it, but there is still, again, which comes back to this idea of otherness, and even within these worlds there is some, it's not often that you'll find that the change itself is just sort of accepted as a thing. I can just think about something as contemporary and as recent as Doctor Who, which is something, you know, that I've always grown up with, the idea that this character can completely change his entire body on a regular basis has never been an issue. But suddenly whenever you bring in the gender element to it, people start kind of feeling a little bit off. And I think a lot of that is just down to sort of a lack of familiarity, a little bit of that. Okay, so I'm kind of prepped for some of the sort of the weirdness and the fantasy elements of it and the change, but now you're asking me to accept something else, and it's maybe for some people it's just too much all at once. But the flip side of that is those kind of worlds and those kind of changes that we have in literature allow us to accept the real world changes far more readily, because we've got the language there, we've got the understanding. It's just some people just take a little bit longer to kind of to register that this is a thing.
Helen?
I'm going to preface this by I'm not trans, so I'm not at all an expert in this, but to kind of go with what Robert was saying as well, even in Doctor Who, there's been evidence with, like, you know, secondary characters and kind of like quick, you know, one-liners where, you know, even other like doctors are able to, you know, other like Time Lords are able to change their gender when they regenerate. And I think when Jodie was announced, it was partly because it was the Doctor, it was the main character, and it was suddenly a big like deal, and it was quite exhausting to see that initial reaction, even though it was kind of expected. And as well, even I think I just to use when I was kind of realizing that I wasn't straight, it's really exhausting having to pretend that, you know, to be someone else and to not be who you are. And I think that it doesn't matter which kind of acronym you fall on under. It's about being true to yourself and and just to kind of try to be happy within yourself, even if other people don't kind of react as you would hope that they would. And I think that's what it boils down to. What is right for the person themselves.
So for this panel, I was hoping like for people to give some sort of recommendations for people for reading. So, from when it comes to a world with queerness, is there a particular book or film that you think is a good example for people to look at? This time I'm going to start with Helen.
One of the ones that I loved, especially if you followed me on Twitter last year, is The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. And it's a fantasy brick. It's over 800 pages long. It's basically got queer characters and dragons, which is basically means that I'm predisposed to loving it. But there's a main relationship between a lesbian and a bisexual woman at the heart, like, of it, that builds over the 800 like pages. But there's other queer characters in it as well, and it's as an example of like a big fantasy novel that's been backed by like a large mainstream publisher, and the fandom of that book, they've actually completely like embraced the main couple. And it was just it's a real comfort read for me, even though it's like 800 pages like long, because it was the first time I kind of saw the fantasy novel that I always wanted to read. There's also a book that's coming out next week. It's called White Trash Warlock by David R. Slayton, and it's basically a gay urban fantasy novel, and it deals with a lot of different elements involving poverty and queerness and how everything kind of like intersects in an American urban setting, and it's quite funny like as well, and dark.
Robert?
I'm going to defer to everyone else on this one. I feel that my knowledge base of the literature and the filmic worlds is not adequate, and also where I feel I sit within the acronyms is in a weird sort of space as well. So I mean, for me, I defer to the possibilities of something like Doctor Who. I think, you know, there's been queer people involved with Doctor Who right from the very first episode in 1963. You know, in terms of the writing and the cast, and a lot of those elements have come through in a kind of subtle way that people haven't realized, and just the communities that built up around that. For me, it's a great show that to just kind of delve into, get something from, and go away, whatever your perspective is. And I think that's, you know, kind of the important thing is that, you know, there should, for some of these things, that, you know, to have something that is approachable, that is devourable by everyone, you know, that everyone can take something away from it and feel that some sort of identification. So, you know, you can sit there with a group of people who are from all sorts of walks of life and sort of gender identities and everything else, and still kind of everyone takes something away. There's not every product out there that can do that, and so that's why for me it's sort of my default.
Do you think it helps that that show has been so mainstream for so long that people kind of accept?
I think it has, but then the other side about that is that we've seen the way that fandom itself can get quite toxic at times, and I think all of us are very aware about the toxicity that exists within certain kinds of fandom, and some of the responses that have been to some of the more overt representations within that show have not been great. There are people who have been very, very vocal about their resistance, in terms of even things like the you know, the way that the trans community have both been, I mean, there's been arguments recently about things like Gareth Roberts, for example, as a, you know, as a gay writer on Doctor Who, but he's made comments that then have been haven't been received well by the trans community, and then there's been you know, an issue there, and then you have this thing that is supposed to be for everybody, and everyone starts divvying down in these little divisions. And like, it reminds me well of things like, you know, the sort of the Star Trek mentality, where you've got this whole world where everyone comes together and they all have their debates and their discussions, and we try and find some pathway through. But ultimately, these represent the way that the world actually is that this is still a world of conflict and disagreeing opinions and lack of understanding and empathy. But its longevity has certainly enabled it to probably get more stuff through than something that's coming out just completely overtly, where there may be more resistance.
Philippa?
Yeah, Robert, Star Trek is a good example. Dax, kind of the character Dax in Trek, was with the symbiotic character within Dax, and then the symbiotic character was male, and then Dax obviously was female. That was an interesting concept and a very progressive concept for Trek at the time and for mainstream television at the time. Something more niche, of course, would be Sense8, and we absolutely loved Sense8 here. We've watched it a few times now, with a trans character and lots of gay relationships, and it certainly did address some of the more difficult issues where the one of the main characters, Leto, loses his career over coming out as gay and trying desperately to pretend that he wasn't gay, and it was a very difficult situation for him, and it kind of typified the attitudes of a lot of people in society.
So I'm going to recommend a couple of different things. One of the very first queer books I read was a mainstream fantasy by Mercedes Lackey called Magic's Pawn. It was published in 1989, and for that time, to me, it was quite groundbreaking coming across it as a 14-year-old to discover this main gay character who encountered all of these difficulties, and you know, it allowed me to open my mind up to the queer community. The book I mentioned in our last question over changing genders was Static by L.A. Witt, and again, it opened my mind to some of the struggles a lot of gender fluid and trans characters can have, and just let me embrace and touch on what might what is an issue for these people and empathize with them. I think on the web there's always AJ and Magnus, which is a fun story of a little boy and his dog with two gay fathers and their struggles through life. And it's just fun at times. AJ is a typical 9-year-old boy, and the queerness is touched on, but not addressed that often. So those would be my three big ones. I have an entire library of queer books I could go through, but let's keep it simple for people.
Okay, so we have a question. What do the panelists think about non-queer writers writing queer protagonists? Is this to be encouraged, or is it better to leave to our own voices? And does this actually call people have been asking people to highlight that they are own voices, and does that cause an issue for an author if they don't want to, for example, out themselves? So I'll start with Helen.
I think own voices as a label started out well, but I do think in some corners it's been kind of narrowed down, and it's kind of been used. It's been used to kind of further label already marginalized identities, because especially because it happened recently with Becky Albert Tolly, who wrote Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda, which was a film called Love So Simon, and because she'd written a book that had done really well with a gay main character for years, she her own identity was actually being questioned to the point where she had to publicly come out, and it's not always safe for people to come out. And as well, just even if you're not coming out, it doesn't mean that you're not questioning things like as well. So I do think in some respects, but I do think it also depends on what kind of story that you're kind of writing or creating, because I don't think a straight person that has never questioned things can always get everything right, because everyone's kind of coming out narrative is so specific. But
I think the video is gone again.
no.
Is that?
I think it had good
Helen.
intentions, but I think really if we start questioning what kind of stories that people can or cannot write, we're no better than straight people deciding that we're all just a bunch of like stereotypes, basically. If you're writing a very specific kind of story, like, you know, coming out narrative, I think you should probably talk to people who have come out, because even to use the Love Simon film, there's one bit in the film that always really, really annoys me, in that because Simon was being blackmailed, he does something really awful to one of his own friends, but it's also coming from a place of fear. And in the film, that fear is never ever like addressed. And I remember being in the, like, you know, cinema seething, because Simon's fear over being out against will is a really legitimate awful fear that could have really like terrible like consequences. So I think Own Voices has a place, but I think there's more nuance to it than that we've probably been giving it. I hope that was okay.
Robert?
Oh, I mean, I think Helen's already touched on this, is that whenever you start dictating who should and shouldn't tell what stories, you enter into a very problematic territory. I understand where that comes from, and there are obviously still difficulties in terms of sort of self-identifying within any of the sort of the queer spectrum in certain places and for certain people, because we don't know what everyone's situation is. We're not in a world where those sorts of things are not without consequence for a lot of people. So there may be multiple reasons at play there. And I always feel like an imposter in these sort of situations, just even in terms of where my own orientation sits and where I feel I belong within the space in my own questioning process. So I find it hard to answer this sometimes, but I think that, you know, for all of literature, we all imagine ourselves, anyone who writes writes from the perspective of multiple characters, from multiple perspectives, multiple genders, multiple nationalities. You know, we don't just write ourselves the whole time. So anyone that, you know, why should we then limit that to, you can only tell queer stories if you're queer? Why should you only be able to tell straight stories if you're straight? That is not the way that literature works. By all means, and I think the essential thing is there, that anyone that wants to tell a story, anyone that's a good writer would probably do some sort of research anyway. You know, they want to try and get into the head of those characters, they want to try and empathize, they want to try and tell it, or they may actually just try and imagine what it's like, which again puts them through that process of actually trying to imagine that space in their own experiences and everything else. But in terms of, I guess, what feels real, in terms of what we actually can kind of identify with, I guess there is a veracity to the lived in experience of somebody who's queer, who's writing about the queer issues, that you're not going to get if you've got somebody who is straight, who's never questioned it, who's never been challenged about it, and they're then trying to put themselves in that situation. That's not a lived in experience for them. It's just something that they're imagining, and that may be an issue. I would hate to see any form of the writing sort of just pushing other people out and other perspectives out. That I think is a danger.
Philippa?
Yeah, good points, Robert. I kind of feel that, I mean, to be somewhat facetious, science fiction writers write about aliens all the time. You know, nobody's an alien, so how, you know, you can't expect science fiction writers to have a lived experience of being an alien. So you can just imagine. So I think it's no harm. In fact, it's a good thing that writers write, and they do their research. They talk to people. They imagine, perhaps, and if they imagine and they get it wrong, then that's a learning process for both themselves and their readers. As I think it was Helen said about Love, Simon, you know, that was a great film, but there were a couple of little issues in it, and it could have been great, could have been a really truly amazing film, but it was good anyway. I suppose it also depends on your audience, and if you're a straight writer writing exclusively for an LGBTQ audience, well, then you're going to be torn asunder if you get things wrong. Whereas if you're going mainstream and the gay community find fault with it, well, the majority of your audience will probably not notice. I'm just thinking, I'm wondering, are we going to talk about at all slash fiction, which is very much written, and it was my introduction to queer writing, if you like, and it was Helen, my wife, who introduced me to it, and it was KS, it was Kirk Spock, you know, slash fiction was an eye opener in so many ways, and that is very much the well, I mean, is it the queer community writing about gay relationships, or is it women writing about Kirk and Spock and in a fantasy, you know? I'm just throwing that out there to be controversial.
Well, no, I mean, I wrote fan fiction when I was a teenager as well, and it did veer into slash over several different fandoms, and it's quite interesting when I look back now, because most of what I wrote was male and slash, but most of what I'm writing now as an actual writer is involving like women and lesbians essentially. So it is it does feel like more it was me figuring things out a little bit, and then by the time I switched back to my own like stories, as they're going, right, this is actually kind of this is what I want to like do. But I don't think I could have gotten to that point without the 10 years of writing fanfic online.
Fanfic is a huge thing. You know, I myself am a straight demisexual writing queer characters. In Fierce and Proud, I've got a gay character. In my previous one, although it's not said, it's a lesbian character. And, you know, if it was own voices, I couldn't write that for people to read. I'm also read a lot in the gay fiction romance world, and a lot of the audience is straight women, and there's a huge debate currently going on in there of who is gay romance being written for? Is it being written for the gay community or straight white women who are fetishizing the gay community? And I think you need to find that balance and that correct placement of making sure that it is true to the queer community and the queer experiences and getting your research, but also open and acceptable to the straight narrative and opening up people to experiences not their own. That has always been the point of fiction, especially speculative fiction, as Philippa touched on. You know, we don't know aliens, and yet a lot of sci-fi people write about aliens, and not just about them, but write as though they are aliens. And you know, that allows you to look at humanity in a new, interesting way as a whole, instead of individual genders and identities. And you know, it allows you to explore things that aren't what you are. And I think that exploration is important. And by cutting off people from exploring it, cutting off straight community from seeing and normalizing these different experiences and othernesses.
Well, that kind of leads into my next question. People who are, you know, like, who are only ever exposed to straight culture are getting more exposed to more queer culture through various stories. How can this be leveraged to improve our world, Quinn?
I think it can be used to leverage by showing how we're just other people. You know, the other thing I am is autistic, so I very much feel that playing someone you're not. And one of the things I'm finding hardest is normalizing what is autism, and not to take over the conversation on queerness here. There is an element there of, let's use this newfound ability of it creeping into straight culture to show we're people. At the end of the day, I'm just a human being. I'm a person. I am a person.
Philippa?
Yeah, we've all got our own individual traits and quirks, and that's wonderful and that's amazing. And a diverse and inclusive society is what's best for the world, for everybody, to be your true self and to bring something different to the world. I as part of my I have a diversity and inclusion company called Under the Rainbow, and we're going to be running a photographic competition. And this was started because on the bus home one night, I saw a bunch of people standing around. A couple of the guys had makeup on, a couple of the girls had tattoos everywhere, they had piercings everywhere. And I went, I'm going to run a photographic competition because this is wonderful. This is amazing. This is the world I want to be in, where this is normal. Nobody was looking at them apart from me. And I was going, wow, brilliant, you know? So this is otherness. This is what we want. This is because I think it shows a maturity to a society that you can accept people for who they are.
Robert?
How can we leverage it? I think was the question, how we leverage these sort of queer representations. I think it's a fascinating thing, because I think that a lot of the time this stuff comes through and we don't even realize that that's what it's doing. I mean, someone on the Twitch channel I see has mentioned Clive Barker. I mean, whilst that we're largely talking about horror in that respect, I mean, Clive Barker's literature, whenever I look at his stuff, I don't automatically think of him being a queer writer, but he is, in the way that his you know, his work has come out, is there and introduce you to other sorts of communities as well. But it does sort of normalize, you know, there is this, there is a normalization of the alternative communities and lifestyles and sexualities that exist beyond the heteronormative within all sorts of places, and I think that they've often been there. I mean, do we mention sort of, you know, the Greeks and the Romans earlier on? I mean, I think about some of the classics I read when I was at school. you know, and these depictions of a society that was clearly far more sexually ambiguous than we expect of that era. I think if my mother had seen some of the stuff that my teacher made me read in sixth form, she would have been appalled. But it was fascinating. And there was never any discussion amongst us about, you know, like, what does this actually imply? What does this mean? And then how does that reflect back on ourselves? So already that stuff is there. There is this sort of expectation. You know, I think I keep on, against my background, I suppose, but I keep on coming back down to the sort of the monumental, iconic power of something like Rocky Horror, which, you know, whilst it is something, I mean, I did an Octocon panel a couple of years ago on this, and there are definitely problems within Rocky Horror and in terms of gender and the way the sexuality is depicted. But it did open things up to a mainstream audience, and it did start helping people to sort of question, partly because what it has is just this lovely joie de vivre. You know, there's a lot of joy in that. There's a lot of, in amongst all the darkness and the macabre and everything else, there's also just plain enjoyment and satisfaction. And I think that's the thing. I think, you know, if you have your characters and they're not marginalized, if they're not ostracized, if you've got people who are part of the world and welcome, then people want to be part of that. People want to know those sorts of people. And I think that's maybe what our responsibility is if we're crafting a world, is to make sure that we're not using somebody in terms of diversity. If you've got, you know, if you're introducing elements of diversity, what you shouldn't be doing is then using them in that kind of old-fashioned way of like, something bad's going to happen to them, they're going to be an omen of misfortune, you know, they're going to be as part of it as everything else. Why can't they be the main characters? Why can't they have the successful relationships? Why can't they be the leaders of a starship and change their gender? I mean, these things are all just, they normalize it. They make us all feel that this is okay. And that's the thing. And again, to come back to Doctor Who, this is the thing that you know, I think both in the casting of, in the way they changed the Master to Missy, and also what they've done with the Doctor now and Jodie Whittaker, is it sort of makes all this completely normal and okay, you know. And that's the important thing. Whilst there's obviously, it still raises issues, because then you can change the way that female character works within that landscape and people's perceptions in terms of gender. There is nonetheless this sort of openness to say, look, people change, and people change is good, and sometimes people are not what you expect, and that's fine. You know, look at the world through a you know, a broader lens. Don't just kind of look at everything really, really narrowly.
Helen?
I think as well, in terms of leverage, is the fact that a lot of these things are becoming mainstream successful. Like books, you know, are doing well, and they're getting readerships beyond kind of niche like audiences. Things like She-Ra recently, I mean, the last season of She-Ra was like a huge thing online, and it's just it's the fact that, to kind of bring it back to the marriage referendum back in 2015, it was both good that it was done through a vote, but I also really resented it, because I remember the night before sitting there kind of going, you know, this is all dependent on a huge like majority of like the country who have no idea who I am. And I think that's kind of how I feel about some aspects of like queer literature and books and movies and TV shows, kind of needing the mainstream audience and to kind of be seen as successful, but also it's good. So it's that weird in between thing of that, like, you need the mainstream to give more opportunities to those who follow, but it's also kind of not great at the same time, if that makes sense.
We have another question from the audience. Would having queer side characters there normalize the experience, or is that another kind of tokenism? Quinn?
You know, when I think of queer side characters, I think of Patricia Bregg's Mercedes Thompson series, where one of her best friends, and one of the conflicts at the very start of the novels, is introducing her best friend's queer lover into the world of werewolves. And to me, it was just normal. It was something that I was really happy to see, this inclusion of queer culture in something as simple as an urban fantasy story. But I do think that you can veer into tokenism if it's kind of just not part of any particular conflict or a planned part of the plot. If they're brought up as queer just to be queer, then yes, they are tokenism. But in this case, it added tension to the scene, it drove the plot forward, and it allowed this character to be reoccurring throughout the series and add more depth to the story in the world. And I think when you're looking at side characters, that's what you need to look at, that basic premise of, does this character add to the plot, and what can I talk about that adds to the plot about this character? You know, the same question can be brought up of, why did J.K. Rowling announce Dumbledore being gay after he was there, but his queerness never impacted that story she was telling. Whereas now, when you get into the crimes of Grimwald and how it should be there and it's missing, that's when you go, well, yeah, maybe it is tokenism.
Yeah, it all comes down to the story, and is the character necessary to the story? Does it bring a depth? Does it bring an element to the world that, if you didn't have a queer character in it, would there be something missing, basically? So it's up to the writer, it's up to the individual writer to decide on this, and you'll see a good writer if seamlessly a character appears and adds depth to a story.
Robert?
Yeah, it runs the risk of being tokenistic. I mean, just the same as, you know, if you talk about someone's skin color, you know, when it you know, it's just there, it maybe ticks a box somewhere along the way. And certainly I know rather cynically that there is funding available in certain paths if you include certain kinds of characters for development and stuff. And so there may be commercial reasons and cynical reasons why people do this. I think about my own world space, and I think about the people around me. And for the most part, I got to be honest, on a day-to-day basis, sexuality doesn't come into most of the conversations that you have with people on a day-to-day. You know, it's just people are people. That is my first question is not about that, but I think it you know, it can be a really important thing. And Captain Jack is someone who was brought into Doctor Who kind of as a side character. You know, his omnisexuality was a big thing, but it kind of seemed very throwaway until the point where the character gets integrated into the show and then ends up running his own show with Torchwood. I mean, then you see the power and the potential in having a character that is like that is able to tell a story and is given the time and the space. Sounds like a pun, but I think that's very, very deliberate. You know, I think that if you give people the spaces, if it's not just, you know, this is a throwaway reference, but then maybe actually the throwaway references just sort of help to show that this is a normal thing as well. So I kind of am quite conflicted because, you know, it's a part of who they are, and it sort of shows you that these characters are part of that normal world, but at the same time it doesn't have to be a big thing, and that would be the normalization of one's sexuality.
I'm going to actually bring in my own writing into this because I've had some interesting reactions in that. In my debut, the two main characters are women, but the big secondary character is Matthias, who's gay, and he's essentially both of their oldest friends for different reasons, and he brings the two of them together, and he has his own plot that's kind of happening kind of off screen and kind of gets occasionally referenced, but his main role there is to link the two narratives like together. And some people really, really like him, and then others resent that he didn't get as much screen time as the two women. And I find that kind of differences in reaction interesting, because his role in a straight romance would kind of be the girl's like best friend, but it's you know, a man, and he's not, because, and it's just, I do think that, like, you know, he's not just the gay best friend because he has his own like agenda. He's part of the main plot as well, and I think it's that kind of thing where you, even if you do decide on a character's sexuality or their gender identity, it's also kind of what role are they actually playing in the main like, you know, story, and how they're, because your secondary characters should be linked to even the main plot peripherally, and they should have their own like stories even if they don't come up as often. So I think it's doing the work and putting in the effort, and I think that way then you actually avoid tropes and stereotypes as well. Because even with the bury like your gaze trope, if most of your cast is queer, you avoid that like trope, because obviously narratives thrive on conflict, and even if you have to kill off a few characters, if they're not your sole queer character or couple, then you've avoided a trope. So I think it's mostly just doing the work.
Okay, I think our time is just up now. I'd like to thank everyone on the panel for taking part. I think next up they have the guest of honor talk, Michael Carroll, being interviewed by former guest of honor Moira McHugh.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Sorry for the glitches. There seem to have been a few.
First virtual con.